Okay, so today we're going to talk about organelles. But before we do, you should know that organelles are really only found in these type of cells here. They are known as eukaryotes. They are not found in the smaller cells known as prokaryotes. And so you can see that they are a very different size. Organelles include things like the nucleus. This is the endoplasmic reticulum in blue. In red here we have the Golgi apparatus. In orange we have mitochondria, centrioles, vacuole, and lysosome. We also have the smooth ER. There are a lot of things in here. Those things are too big to be in a prokaryote. As you can see, it just won't fit in there. And so prokaryotes are things like bacteria. And I can show you an example of this relative difference in size. The other day we did a lab, and here's the photo that I took, where I swabbed the inside of my cheek. Now, if you were in school, you got to do this. However, if you were home, there was no way to really help you to do this. But this was what we found when we looked under the microscope. I'll try to include some sort of video assignment so you guys can see how this was done, because you do need to know how to do this. Basically, what we did was we took a swab of our cheek and we found our cells here. And so you can see what is shown here. This is the lipid bilayer. And then this dark spot here is the nucleus, and that is where all the DNA is. You can see all this little stuff out here. Those are all small little bacteria. And so as you can see, the prokaryotes are much, much smaller than the eukaryotes. What's more is these prokaryotes are always single-celled organisms, whereas these tend to be together in multicellular organisms. Okay, so we're not going to really talk about this too much. I did, however, want to show you one more example of size difference. So if we look at a prokaryote here, there's something even smaller than bacteria. And we're going to have to really zoom in to see it. Maybe you can see it already. Right here. And so this is a virus. This particular virus is known as a bacteriophage, where phage just means virus, and bacterio means it infects bacteria. This is the only virus you have to remember the shape of. There are other viruses. For example, COVID-19 looks like this. And then HIV, which causes AIDS, looks like this, but then there's a layer around it. And then there's also rabies. Rabies looks like this. And so there are different types of viruses, but the one you have to recognize is the bacteriophage. It kills about 40% of all bacteria in the ocean every day. And so the way it works is it has this outside layer. This is called a capsid. And it is made of protein. On the inside, we have the genetic material. And so those nucleic acids are secreted into the bacteria. And what happens is one of two things. Either it's floating in the cytoplasm where ribosomes will take it and create more viruses, or it will actually become integrated with the DNA of the bacteria and making it a permanent infection. So those are different strategies. But I just really wanted you to see the size difference there. So in order of size, eukaryotes are the biggest, prokaryotes are the second biggest, and then viruses are the smallest. Now on to the organelles. The first organelle that we'll talk about is the nucleus. The nucleus contains DNA, and what we're seeing right here is a stringy form of it called chromatin. It's very stringy. This chromatin can take a different shape, and we call that chromosomes. It does this when the cell needs to divide. And the reason why it does this is because this particular shape is easy to cut in half. This ensures that when we double our DNA, making the same gene twice, that each cell gets the same DNA. If we were to cut chromatin in half, it would be random which parts of the DNA each new cell would get. So this stuff is chromatin. And the more condensed form is chromosome, of which there are 23 pairs. More on that later. Other things we should notice about the nucleus is the very center mass here. There's a dense ball of yarn-looking kind of DNA. There's just lots of strands of DNA in here. And that is called the nucleolus. And so the nucleolus contains the genetic material or instructions necessary to build ribosomes. Ribosomes, we'll learn about later, are sort of the builders of the cell. If the cell is a city, they are the builders. And so we'll learn about those later. So the nucleolus creates ribosomes. Or at least it is the instructions to create ribosomes. Okay, so that's the nucleus, and now we're going to move on to the next part. This organelle here, very important. It is known as the endoplasmic reticulum. There's actually two of them, and so this one here is known as the rough. It's known as the rough endoplasmic reticulum because of these ribosomes here, which I just mentioned. If the ribosomes are the workers that build the cell, the endoplasmic reticulum is the factory. The workers have to work somewhere. Now, some ribosomes do float around outside of this. We can see them here. But most of them are on the endoplasmic reticulum, specifically the rough. There is also, over here, the smooth endoplasmic reticulum. The smooth endoplasmic reticulum is really good at making fats and lipids, and so it helps to build the cell membrane. It also helps to make other fats like hormones. So a very important part of the cell. Okay, next we have the Golgi apparatus right here in red. The Golgi apparatus does two things. Number one, it helps to finish building proteins. And so what happens is in the ER here, ribosomes make something that we've talked about before. They make polypeptides. Polypeptides are just a string of amino acids. That has to be folded. A lot of structure created in the cell is really just microscopic origami. And so these amino acids, this polypeptide here, they are going to fold. And I'm abbreviating polypeptide there. So the Golgi apparatus is going to fold these polypeptides. And then it's going to ship them. And the way it ships them is in these little bubble-looking things. You could think of them like a UPS package. Those little bubble things are called vesicles. Conveniently, they are made of the same stuff that the cell membrane is made of, lipids. That way they can fuse with the cell membrane. They can also fuse with other organelles. And we'll watch a video about that at some point. Next, we'll talk about the mitochondria, one of my favorite organelles. To me, this is just a very interesting organelle. It helps to make energy for the cell. So we'll talk about that. The mitochondria. And actually, I should not say that it makes energy, because according to the laws of the universe, you can't do that. You can only transfer energy from one form to the other. So for example, your car, it transfers the energy of fossil fuels into electric energy, and then that into kinetic energy, which is movement. And so really, nothing on our planet generates energy. It only transforms it. Plants, for example, transform the energy from sunlight into a storable energy source called sugar. These mitochondria are converting the energy found in your food, calories, into a usable form of cellular energy called ATP. Now, ATP is like a battery. And this battery powers your cell. However, your batteries run out as they get used. When they run out, they're no longer called ATP. They're called ADP. And let me describe the difference. ATP, on the right side of your screen, looks like this. It's a sugar that has 3 phosphates. When the energy of ATP is used up, basically it loses one of those phosphates, and instead it becomes ADP. All that the mitochondria does is attach that 3rd phosphate back on, therefore recharging your cellular batteries. What is so interesting about these is that they are actually ancient bacteria. So you remember this guy down here. Basically, a long time ago, there was a bacteria that looked like this. And our ancient ancestral cells ate it. Kind of. They kind of ate it. They tried to eat it. The process is called phagocytosis, which is something we'll learn about a lot in the next section. It's basically when a cell eats something. So the way it does it is, imagine that this is a cell, and this is a particle it's trying to eat. What the cell can actually do is extend its membrane out like this. What in the world? Oh. and it can sort of eat another cell, right? So that's called phagocytosis, and that's what we did to ancient mitochondria. However, instead of digesting it, the cell instead decided to form a partnership. And so we already learned in chapter 3 that relationships are called symbiosis. And when it's inside of a cell, we call that endosymbiosis. So endosymbiosis was the process by which we evolved to work with mitochondria. We give it a nice, safe place to live, and in exchange, they help to charge our batteries. So that's the powerhouse of the cell. The next organelle that we'll talk about, and I'm just guessing this is the one here, this is going to be our lysosome. Lys means to kill. So for example, you might have seen Lysol. That kills 99.9% of all bacteria. That's why they call it Lysol, because it kills all. Lys just means to kill or break. And so the lysosome has strong acids inside of it. And enzymes. These enzymes help to tear things apart. And so what we do with our lysosome is two things. We kill invaders, like if a virus invades us, we will take it to the lysosome. And we also can recycle old, worn-out organelles, and that is called autophagy. Autophagy is a buzzword lately in the nutrition world. It basically means to eat oneself. The lysosome is why we are able to do that. And the reason why it's a good thing is because it recycles worn-out parts of the cell. When cells accumulate damage, that can lead to toxicity in the cell. And that toxicity can actually affect your DNA, which can age you. And so proper autophagy is really key to maintaining youth for as long as possible. The way that you do that is through something called fasting. And so what people do is they make sure they eat a whole lot, or at least a normal diet, and then every now and then they stop eating. And what this does is it gets the body used to eating a certain amount of food. That's called increasing your metabolism. And then you stop eating, and so your body still is demanding those same level of calories. To help fill that need, the lysosome will activate autophagy and recycle worn-out parts of the cell. A very interesting and overlooked organelle. Next, we have the vacuole here. And this is just where the cell is going to store food and water. It's pretty small in animal cells, and sometimes numerous. We'll have a whole bunch of them. But in plant cells, it's a lot bigger. So I just pulled up an image here of a plant cell. And you can see here is the vacuole, and it's called the central vacuole in a plant. It's really big in a plant because it is exerting pressure, sort of like inflating the cell. This is why a plant that is fed enough water, it will look better than a plant that is not. So plants that are not given water, they will start to wilt, and that is because the central vacuole is deflated. We're actually going to talk a little bit more about plants. There are a few structures found in this plant cell that just aren't found in this animal cell. And so for one, you can look at the shape of this and you can see that it's pretty irregular. And that is because this layer here is called the lipid bilayer. And so lipid means fat. It is made of a gelatinous-like fatty material. It's a really cool membrane. It lets some stuff in, but some stuff it does not. And so it is what we call selectively permeable. More on that later. But it's squishy. Compare that to a plant. It also has a cell membrane, but it has a cell wall as well. And this cell wall is made of what's called cellulose, which means sugar of the cell. OSE as a suffix means sugar. And then obviously cell means cell. So it is the cell sugar. It makes the cell wall. This is a very rigid structure, and it is why plants tend to be a little bit less flexible than, say, animals. There is another structure that plants have that animals don't. They have chloroplast. They have mitochondria like we do too. Here you can see one. But the difference between a plant and an animal is that plants are able to directly feed their mitochondria with their chloroplasts. Chloroplasts are capable of what's called photosynthesis, which takes in sunlight and helps to create sugars. And so that sugar directly feeds the mitochondria. We do not have chloroplasts. We're going to talk a lot more about chloroplasts in the next chapter. So I think we covered all of the organelles. Now I just want to talk about what's going on around those organelles. And so what's all this orange space? That is a jelly-like substance known as cytoplasm. It is the jelly of the cell. And so if we look at that word, cyto means cell, and plasm means jelly. So it is cell jelly. The reason why it can't just be water is because these organelles would just jump around too much and it would cause damage. And so this jelly-like substance just helps to hold them in place a little bit. In addition, we have these little spindles here, and that's creating what is called the cyto, meaning cell, skeleton. Cytoskeleton. It is the skeleton of the cell. It helps to hold things together. And actually, in this picture, we're showing only a few of them. In reality, they are just everywhere. They're all over the cell, holding organelles together. And they're very, very important. Not only do they create the structure of the cell, but they also act as little highways. I mentioned before that these little bubble things coming off of the Golgi, they are like shipments. In order to ship something, you need a roadway, and so typically vesicles are held by proteins called kinesins, and they are transported to their next location along the cytoskeleton. And the cytoskeleton is made of two different types of roads. There are microtubules, which are literally just tubes. And then there are actin filaments. Generally, there will be a microtubule, and then actin filaments come off of them as side roads. All right, so that's all for today. Thanks for hanging in there. Actually, hold on just a second. Now that I think about it, there are a couple things I should mention here, and these are generally outside of the cell. This little tail-like thing here is called a flagella. We only find those in one type of human cell, and that is sperm. It is a tail-like structure that helps in movement, and it spins around like a helicopter blade. Now, sometimes something with a flagella will make something go forward, but sometimes it's like a helicopter, and it will make them go the other way. It depends on which direction that it spins. We see that here in this bacteria. It's right here. But we also see this hair stuff here, and that is called cilia. Cilia also can help with movement, and we typically find them on smaller cells like bacteria. However, there are some cells in the human body, such as those that line I believe the esophagus, that are ciliated, and that helps us to move mucus, basically, along our esophagus. Or maybe it's the trachea. I can't remember right now. So that's pretty much it. There are a couple things we can see here with this bacteria that are not in human cells. So for example, it does have a cellular membrane here, but it has two more layers here, and that's a cell wall. And it is not made of cellulose like plants. Instead, it is made of something called peptidoglycan, which literally just means peptide with sugar. So it's sort of like protein mixed with cellulose. You can imagine. All right, so that's it.